Hello. I'm going to talk a little bit about this early 18th century brass dial English long case clock. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's put together and also how I came up with what I think is an approximate date when it was made. I have the hood removed now so that we can see the dial a little more closely, and also so I can go around to the side and look into the clockworks themselves and talk about those. This clock was made by John Kerfoot, who is listed as a watchmaker. He was from West Derby, which is, I believe, now a suburb of Liverpool. During the early 18th century, it would have been a small town nearby. As I said, he's listed as a watchmaker. He died in 1736, so we know that this clock can't be any later than that date. This is a brass dial, square brass dial clock. And during the 17th and first two-thirds of the 18th century, all English clocks were brass dial. And it's made up of several different elements. You have a dial plate here made of brass, and you have these other applied elements. You have the corner decorations, these cast corner decorations known as spandrels. You have a chapter ring where the numbers and other engravings are. This has a seconds ring as well. Also has winding holes with rings around them, and this also has a ring around the date box. You can date a clock by the style of many of these details. The spandrels changed every couple of decades or so in popularity. This is a style with two cherubs holding a crown. They're also holding maces. There was another even more popular style of spandrel with two cherubs holding a smaller crown, and they were not holding maces. And those appeared perhaps a little bit earlier than this style, although they were both being used in the first couple of decades of the 18th century. There were a number of other different styles of spandrels as well. The chapter ring is made of brass. It's also applied to the dial plate. It's treated with a silver powder so that it gives an effect of being made of silver or pewter, and this not only gives the clock some visual flair, but it also helps the engravings and the numbers to stand out, and which would be very important, especially during the 18th century when you're trying to read a dial like this by candlelight. The markings on the chapter ring help to give an approximate date. This inner part of the chapter ring is divided into quarter hours. There's an interesting reason for this. Before 1660 or so, clocks had one hand, and as a sundial did, the hour hand would point to the quarter hours, and a sundial, the shadow, would point to the quarter hour. So getting time to the nearest quarter or half quarter hour was close enough. The reason that they continued to have these one-handed clock features on a two-handed clock is interesting. It seems unusual and sort of odd to us, but when the minute hand appeared, many people used to the one-handed clock apparently found the minute hand confusing. So they continued to use the one-handed clock markings on two-handed clocks so people could ignore the minute hand and simply tell time to the nearest quarter hour or half quarter hour by looking at the hour hand. Say a sundial had done the same thing with this shadow on the quarter hour. These markings here, I think it's going to strike soon, and I will let it do its thing when it does. These are half-hour markers, and you can also date a clock by looking at the style of these markers. This half-hour marker has a tail that goes all the way to the inside of the chapter ring. Later on, by the 1730s or so, often these tails had disappeared and these were floating in midair. After that, the half-hour markers disappeared altogether. The quarter-hour markers also disappeared, probably by the 1730s or so. This has a half-quarter marker, 7.5 minutes, and that does require the minute hand to point that out. It does. The half-quarter markers, 7.5 minutes, was really sufficient for most people in the 18th century. They didn't care about getting time down to the nearest minute as we are, but a half-quarter hour was close enough. And so these help them to come up with the that 7.5 minutes. These also disappeared later in the 18th century. The numbers here occupy this outside ring of the chapter ring. During the 17th century, they were smaller and they occupied this minutes ring here. And by 1700 or so, they had moved to the outside of the ring. They became larger as the 18th century progressed. These are still fairly small, so that's once again also an earlier feature. Later on in the 18th century, so they got larger. In the 17th century, they were actually much smaller. This also has a silvered seconds ring, and these winding holes with the rings around them, and the ring around the date box is also an early feature. This has a date box here. It's a big ring that turns around. Now that is also made of brass, but silvered. If you look on the inside of a clock like this, there are also some hints as to the approximate time that it was made. See if we have enough light. Yes, this is a plated movement clock. It has a front brass plate and a back brass plate. The plates are held together by these turned brass rods called pillars. They changed in style during the 18th century, becoming progressively simpler. The 17th and early 18th century style pillars look like this. They have a knob in the center, and then these little rings turned around them. These are called finned pillars, and so they had disappeared, 1720s, 1730s. They were becoming simpler. There are also some other features on the inside of this clock which suggest an early date. We can't really see them, but there is some nice decoration, file decoration on some of the parts. It's a very nicely made clock. It's had some work done on it, some sort of heavy-handed restorations and some replacement screws, but all in all, it's in pretty good original shape. So all of the features, both inside and outside of this clock, suggest an early date. I consulted with two very respected British experts on these clocks, and they came up with slightly different dates. One of them, the first one, suggested 1720 to 1730. The other, who was an expert on London clocks, said that had this clock been made in London, he would date it at 1700 or so. It does imitate a London style. But he said it wasn't made in London, it was made fairly far away, outside of Liverpool. So he would add 10 or more years to it, which would give a date of 1710 to 1720 or so. So between the two, if you said 1710 to 1730, we certainly would have the date of this clock. After doing a lot of research and comparing the details in this clock with others that I found in numerous books that I've been reading, the date that I've come up with, I believe, is about 1715. Doesn't mean that it might not be later, also could be earlier. It's hard to tell, especially with regional clocks, because you had conservative makers who stuck with old ways, and you had makers who were up to date with the latest styles. So it's a little hard to tell. But this has all the early features, and certainly within the first 3 decades of the 18th century. The case is a different matter. The case is from the late 18th century, made of mahogany. We know that this cannot possibly be the original case for this clock because they weren't making mahogany cases when this clock was made. So stylistically, and the material puts it in the late 18th century, perhaps even into the early 19th century. I'm going to be making another video and hopefully posting it soon. I'll have the hood back on the clock, and I'll discuss the case and when I think the clock was put into the case, because I think there's some evidence that shows that this clock has been with this case for a very long time, say for 180 or 200 years or so. So I will hopefully be posting that soon, and I would like to thank you for watching.